So it's week 2, and this week we are going to talk a little bit about point of view and dialogue, two important elements to writing a short story. Everything I'll say on the video and more will be in the lecture notes labeled point of view and dialogue. And you'll have a discussion prompt and a writing prompt. And I hope now that people are starting to think about their first stories and digging in and starting to write those and push those. I'm looking forward to the workshop part of the course. Just briefly, point of view is how you tell the story. And you can tell the story in a number of ways. First person, third person. First person is the I point of view. Third person is the he, she, they point of view. Some stories are told in the you point of view, but oftentimes those are a little bit quirky. I don't suggest you start off writing stories in the second person point of view, and oftentimes they become like first person points of view. So let's concentrate on either telling our stories from the first person I or the third person he or she. What's the advantage? The I point of view is much more intimate, obviously much more personal. It's also much more limited. We only see from this point of view, so that is our picture of the world. A third person point of view, he or she, is a little bit more open. It gives you a little bit more of a perspective on the world in general. There are two words that we should associate with point of view. There's something called limited point of view and something called omniscient point of view. Limited is just that. First person is very limited. It's right there. Now, some first person narrators do have a large perspective of the world, and so their writing camera, in a sense, their view opens up. Third person points of view are a little bit more omniscient. What is omniscient? All knowing. Omni all, scio knowing. All you Latin scholars in the house know that. It's your choice how omniscient you want to make your narration. Most stories, even if they're told in the third person, even if they have a little bit more of a large perspective with the writing camera, they don't want to be too large. The largest perspective is God, if you believe in him or her, right? That's the all-knowing perspective. Newspaper articles are in many ways omniscient. They give you the facts, they give you a broad spectrum. We're not doing that in this class. We're writing fiction that's going to touch us and punch us. And so you want the perspective to be personal, and just by virtue of being personal, it's not going to be so omniscient. It's going to be much more limited. So think about how you want to tell your story. By the way, all of these choices that you're going to be making, in some ways they are natural choices. So when you start writing, automatically your voice is going to start to kick in, and you will almost know yourself what you're more comfortable writing in, first person or third person. Now that doesn't mean that once you start writing the story, you might say to yourself, you know what, maybe I made the wrong unconscious choice. Maybe I need to make a conscious choice, switch this third person story to first person to make it more personal, or switch this first person to third person to give the reader a slightly larger view of the piece. So point of view in the person place, very important. The other place you have to think about in point of view is tense, right? There's person and there's tense. Tense, we either have present or we have past. Future tense, it's going to be, again, too, I think, quirky and experimental for the nuts and bolts we're trying to play around with in this class. We're starting out as short story writers. Present tense stories have a much more immediate feel. Let's say we're writing a sports story. Sports is so in the moment, in the now. Perhaps present tense would be the way to go with a sports story. Past tense gives you a little bit more room to editorialize, to sort of hash out some things that are happening in the story. It allows the character, looking back slightly, even though it might feel present-y, to add a little bit more observation about what is happening, quote unquote, in the moment of the story. So choose the tense. Most stories are written in the past tense. But if you feel present tense is really going to work for your story, certainly use that. So first person, third person, present tense, or past tense. Those are the points of view. This week I also want you to think about dialogue. That's the exercise that I've given you. Dialogue is the spoken word in the story. Since Our stories are going to be character driven, and chances are characters always interact with other characters. There is going to be dialogue in your story. The talk, the back and forth, that's interesting. And it's also a way, by the way, to develop character, right? How you speak versus how you think, let's say, says something about you, your character. When you're writing dialogue, just remember this, and I've given you some pointers in the lecture notes. Dialogue should be important to the story, and because stories are economical art forms, we have to pick and choose how much we want in the back and forth in the story. Stay away from throwaway dialogue. Most of what we say in our day-to-day lives is throwaway. Hello, hi, how are you doing? I'm pretty well. How are you? Pretty well. How was your weekend? It was okay. Da 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 da. It all adds up to not much. In an economical art form, you want to make sure that your stories have strong dialogue, that it's resonant, and that in some ways it drives the story forward and lends itself to some meaning. When you're writing dialogue, again, just a couple of tidbits of advice. A simple he said or she said or I said is enough. I call them attributives. You don't need to explain how someone says something, because if your dialogue is realistic and strong, we're going to be able to hear the tone of voice under the words. So pay attention to that. Keep it simple. Keep the words themselves interesting, but the he says and she says, that's all you need. And I've showed you how to punctuate dialogue so that it is nice and clean and correct on the page. Something else to think about dialogue. What is a motivation? We all have motivations when we speak, even if they're mild motivations. Remember that when you're writing dialogue. And think about something called subtext. I've assigned a Hemingway story who is the master of subtext. What is subtext? It's what's underneath the words. Hey, how you doing? I'm fine. Now on the page, I'm fine. I'm fine. But if we say it, I'm fine, in the subtext, things are not so fine. Something may have happened. Something may be concerning the speaker. Again, if you write the dialogue in a realistic and nuanced way, we're going to be able to hear that tone. So think about motivation and think about subtext. And I think you'll be on the right path to writing strong dialogue. Read the Hemingway story. He's a master of dialogue. Some people have some knocks to say about Hemingway, his misogynistic behavior and so forth. But as a technician, as a writer of dialogue, look closely at what he does. I think we can learn a lot. I'm not saying mimic his dialogue, but look how he uses subtext. The story is Hills Like White Elephants, and you will see this story. I'm going to give away the plot line, which really is about thinking about an abortion. The word's never mentioned, but we hear the subtext in the back and forth between the man and the woman. And the woman, who's described at the beginning as a girl, rises up in the story and becomes really the more powerful person in the story. So read Hills Like White Elephants and see technically what Hemingway's doing with dialogue. And then do the dialogue exercise. That'll force you to think about writing dialogue with subtext. I also gave you a little handout. You can look at that about how not to write dialogue. It's very exaggerated, but I think it will help you when you're writing your own. And again, dialogue will be important to your stories. Start writing, if you haven't already, your first short stories. The workshops are coming up fairly soon, a couple of weeks, and I look forward to reading those. So work hard on those. So some things to do this week, but write is right, and that's what we want to do. Again, remember, I'm holding office hours for this class on Thursdays from 11 to 12, so I'll be online. If you want to email me at my John J. email address, I will be right there to answer your questions immediately, and that should do it. Okay, write well, and I will speak to you next week.